Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Edinburgh International Book Festival. My name's Charlotte Higgins. I'm a journalist and author, and it's a huge pleasure to be with you here for this very special event with Rory Stewart. Now, full disclosure, Rory and I have known each other slightly for quite a long time because we were students together at Balliol College, Oxford, the institution that also spawned the brothers Johnson, Boris and Joe. It's funny how people turn out so differently, isn't it? But beyond that, the similarities fade very quickly away. I've worked at The Guardian for 20 years. Rory has had a much more varied time. Before I even knew him, he had served a short commission in the Black Watch. During the holidays, when we were students together, he was tutoring Princes William and Harry. After university, he joined the Foreign Office and worked in Montenegro and in Indonesia. He then left the Foreign Service in order to walk across Iran, Afghanistan, India, Pakistan, and Nepal, which resulted in his wonderful book, The Places in Between, which won the Ondaatje Prize and was hailed as an all-out classic by the New York Times. He then served in Iraq for the coalition as deputy coordinator of a governorate of Iraq. Out of that experience came another book, Occupational Hazards. After that, he worked in Afghanistan running a charity that was reviving traditional crafts in Kabul, and he took up a chair in human rights at Harvard. In the wake of the expenses scandal, David Cameron put out a call to people who hadn't served in politics before, inviting them to take up candidacies for the Conservative Party. Rory answered that call and was returned as MP for Penrith and the Border. He served in various government roles, in DFID, as Justice Minister, and latterly in the Cabinet as Secretary of State for International Development. He was an outsider candidate in the recent Conservative Party leadership election. As you know, he came a very honourable fifth. I did surprisingly well, and had the dubious, I think very dubious honour of being the candidate who everybody who didn't actually have a vote in that election would have preferred to have seen as leader of the party. I think it's a wonderful opportunity to be with Rory. This is his first public event since he resigned from the government, having said that he couldn't serve under Boris Johnson. So please join me in welcoming Rory Stewart. Rory, I'm curious to know what you've been up to since the summer. I think you said you were going to go walking, which is a very Rory Stewart thing to do. And how has the dust settled? What have you been doing since you resigned?
Well, I've been in the States. My wife is American, and I've been in Scotland. My mother lives in Crieff. So to give you a glimpse of walking, just to take the last 2 days. Yesterday I was with my two sons, who are there. There's a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old, not visible, but hidden somewhere in the corner there. We climbed what my 4-year-old would call a big mountain near Glenturret yesterday. And then today I was walking around Glasgow, particularly focused on issues around addiction and homelessness. And that was very, very striking. I mean, it's just a simple thing. We were there, I guess, for 4.5 hours, and it was just a question of stopping, talking to people in the streets, and often talking to people sitting in doorways about their lives, and in particular about heroin. Nearly twice as many heroin users proportionally in Glasgow as almost any other city in the United Kingdom. So these walks are both great exercise, but also an opportunity to see things that I don't necessarily see as a constituency MP. I represent the Lake District in Cumbria, and one of the great privileges of having had the ability to stand as a leadership candidate is it's suddenly given me, I feel, permission to travel to other parts of Britain, such as Glasgow today and tomorrow, Newcastle, and then on to Hartlepool on Wednesday, and then on to Manchester on Thursday, and so on and so forth.
And you've also written so beautifully about walking in Britain in your last book, the marches, which talked about that whole area of the English-Scottish border. But what is it that can be gained from being on your 2 feet, shoe leather, as a politician and as a writer?
Well, I think walking is very, very different in the developing world compared to what it's like in Britain. So when I walk through Afghanistan, I'm walking in a landscape where everybody else is walking. When I walked through central Afghanistan, the roads were closed by snow, so for nearly 32 days there were no cars. And when I walked into Bamiyan, for example, I was walking at the same pace as probably another 100 people walking into the market with me. So I'm walking alongside oxen, I'm walking alongside donkeys. In Britain, the landscape is empty. There are very, very few people out in the fields. Industrialized agriculture means there are fewer and fewer people around. Even on the national trails, you see surprisingly few people. So for me in Britain, walking is a bit of a misnomer. It's really about standing. What I do in Britain is I choose a place, for example, Wigan or Poplar in London, and I send out a little tweet saying, I'm going to be at Crisp Street Market in Poplar at 11 o'clock, and then I just stand there and see who turns up. And then I do very short walks with people. But often it'll be a lady saying, there are some heroin addicts shooting up in the ladies' loo, come and look. Or somebody will say, there's been a knife attack in the estate, come and look. And I'll go on a sort of 300-yard walk, and then I'll just stand again.
I'm wondering, Andy, do we have footage of Rory's walk today? 2 seconds before we went on, we were trying to fix this up.
Needles. This actually, a lot of this stuff is kit, which is given out free in order to try to protect people. So, a little yellow packet here is citric acid. You can see there a single-use needle. This is for cooking. Let's see what else we got. This plastic is probably what the heroin itself came in, but just to get a sense of the scale of the thing. You can see that there's quite a wide area here where maybe half a dozen maybe 2 or 3 people will be here a lot. Obviously hasn't been cleaned up for a long time. This issue is really striking. I've been out, Simon Community, who've been working with homelessness in Glasgow for a long time, they will often see the same half a dozen, 20 people every day who will be going in and out of accommodation. The fundamental issue, though, for most people is this question of addiction, and in particular, treatment services. Very, very large number of people in Scotland addicted. The rates in Glasgow seem to be higher than other parts of the United Kingdom, and there isn't enough support for treatment services. I think probably only about a third of people are adequately accessing treatment services. So that's really my focus this morning.
Thank you very much. That was near Salt Market in Glasgow, was it?
Yeah.
And what do you conclude from this? You talk about the failure of services, and yet you actively signed up to a government that presided over an astonishing 10 years of austerity, 10 years, 5 years of austerity, which has caused a tide of human misery. I'm just wondering how you square that statement about falling services and the policies that you voted for.
Well, I think there are a number of ways of coming at this. One of them is there's no doubt that there is a real problem of lack of money, so lack of resources. So one of the reasons why addiction services are not good is there aren't enough people and there's not enough support behind it. I think there are other things that you learn by doing these kind of journeys. One of them is the differences between different parts of the United Kingdom. There are twice as many, and this I think probably would surprise the audience. In fact, let me take a show of hands. Would you guess that there are twice as many addiction treatment services per head of population in England or in Scotland? So who thinks there is more money going into addiction treatment in Scotland? Hands up. Right? And who thinks more money going to addiction treatment in England? Oh, okay, so we're about 50-50. So the answer is that the situation is far better in England than in Scotland. So in England, nearly twice as many people, nearly 2/3 of people who are addicts receive treatment. In Scotland, it's barely a third. And at the same time, the rates of addiction in Glasgow are nearly twice what they would be in London or Manchester or Birmingham. So there is the money problem that Charlotte mentioned. There are these national issues. But I think that the thing for me which is most important as a politician is trying to get out of the conversations about poverty with a capital P or austerity with a capital A down to actually talking to people in doorways. Because actually, if I think about what I did this morning in Glasgow, the least informative, the least satisfying part of the conversation was with the professionals, with the people who were actually running Hep C and HIV treatment, who, when I tried to ask questions about working with people, kept bringing it back to your government, austerity, UN reports, WHO reports. And it was very, very difficult to reduce it to what does it feel like in a person's home. Whereas as soon as I actually got into the doorway of Tesco's in Glasgow and talked to a guy who was sitting in the doorway in Tesco's, suddenly I get a much, much more textured vision. I get a vision of a guy who has 7 brothers and sisters. He's the only addict in his family. He's been visiting his sister that morning. He says that he's no longer on heroin or cocaine, but you can see that he looks about 60 and he's actually in his early 30s. He's lost almost all his teeth, almost certainly because the methadone script, which seems to be wiping out his teeth. There is a real sense of struggle. And of course, he will say the problem is that he can't get accommodation, but then the person standing with me says, actually, we put him into accommodation a week ago, and then he came out 2 days later. So for me as a politician, I think that the challenge about Charlotte is, yes, there are huge problems around money and funding, but I think both as a prisons minister and in what I'm doing in the walks, the real key is to try to get off these very, very abstract, big stories around austerity with a capital A to what exactly is happening in that doorway in Glasgow, what exactly is working or not working, and why is it not working there, why is it working better somewhere else?
And does this broader view you're taking now that you're, as it were, only a constituency MP now, you're not in the government, and yet you're taking clearly a broad interest in matters of national interest, does that mean you are going to have another crack at the leadership when it will inevitably perhaps come? Don't pretend you're not thinking about it.
No, I'm definitely thinking about it. I mean, it's a very, very difficult question. The answer is that I have to balance 2 or 3 things in my mind. One of them is that I believed very strongly in compromise. So I believed that the solution to the Brexit situation was a soft Brexit, a sort of pragmatic, moderate Brexit, where we'd leave the political institutions but remain very close to Europe economically. I voted, for example, for a customs union. And the reason why I believe this is that I'm very, very worried about polarization. I'm very worried that if we go either for a no-deal Brexit or we reverse the referendum and go for Remain, we're going to end up with 40 years of a country split right the way down the middle. But I lost that argument very, very strongly. And indeed, the withdrawal agreement, which I was arguing for as a soft Brexit, has now been rejected again and again and again. So I'm now actually in a situation as a politician where I don't really know what I'm supposed to be saying. I mean, my instinct is to say, again, go back to Parliament again next week and say, we must find a compromise, we must go for a soft Brexit, we must re-energize the withdrawal agreement. But I'm now speaking to who? 10 people, 15 people? Because Parliament is now divided between a Conservative Party, which is now lining up behind Boris for a no-deal Brexit, and Labour and the Lib Dems that are increasingly pushing for a second referendum and Remain. So my vision of politics worked in a day when public opinion was a sort of bell curve where most voters were in the centre. Now public opinion is like a U-shape. And for somebody like me who's in the center, it's a pretty lonely place to be because most of the views are now on the 2 extremes. And that then means that although many people kindly come up to me and say, unlucky this time, better luck next time, I'm sure that you'll be, one of my friends just said to me, you'll be the next leader but one, or whatever the statement was. Of course, as a working politician, I know actually how difficult that really would be to do, because in a way what I'm about to do, which is to go back and vote against a no-deal Brexit, will mark me in the eyes of many of my colleagues and many party members as a traitor who's been trying to undermine the whole project. And that will probably damage me for 5 or 10 years. So the actual question Charlotte's asked is one that I have to think about very seriously, and I have to think about, you know, I'm 46 now, and I have to think about the next 25 years of my life. How can I be most useful? What can I actually do for this country? And it may be that spending the next 15, 20 years of my life trying to be a Prime Minister may not be the most useful contribution I can make. Yeah.
So many things in that answer, and I just want to zero in on one of them just now, which is when you said that you would be branded as a traitor, and to me that suggests, I mean, who would have talked in those terms 10 or 15 years ago? There is something has happened to language, to rhetoric, and to narrative in this country, all matters on which you're somewhat expert, being an excellent writer. Your book, The Marches, in a sense, was about a search for national narrative, sort of patching together your father, who was a colonial administrator's love of empire, with your own kind of doubts about the current shape of Britain and the current direction of Britain. Can you see a way through this increasingly polarised rhetoric and language, or are we stuck here? How worried are you?
Well, it's a real, it's very perplexing. It's very, very difficult to work out what's happening, because, of course, the answer is that very, very large numbers of people in Britain are thoughtful, moderate, serious. In fact, actually, most people in my constituency, if you catch them on the right subject on the right day, are thoughtful, moderate, and serious. If I talk to somebody about their own business or their own family, they're immensely realistic and pragmatic. So to take an example, and somehow what's odd is that politics is now defying all the rules of normal life. So you vote for a Prime Minister who sounds optimistic and promises things that you might actually suspect are probably impossible, but it doesn't matter, you still vote for him. But in the home, you wouldn't do that. If your partner, your wife or your husband said to you, "We're moving to Mauritius for 7 years tomorrow," you'd say, "You're out of your mind. What are you talking about? We don't have any money. You don't have a job in Mauritius. We're not going to do it." But somehow, in the world of politics, the prize goes to the person that can make the most extravagant and improbable promise. And nobody actually, the word that's been lost in the whole debate is the word how. Nobody ever wants to say, how are you going to do this? How are you going to get from A to B? In fact, one of the extraordinary things that I found in the leadership campaign is people could just sort of shrug it off. Enormous problems they could shrug off. They could say that they were going to get a transition period with a no-deal Brexit, and I could point out that was impossible, and it didn't matter. Just shift on, something else. I mean,
so why aren't things sticking in this way? Why have we got to this? Because it seems to me that Boris Johnson and co.'s particular form of rhetoric is exactly this. It's a sort of hot air bubble of empty claims. It's the triumph of empty rhetoric. I mean, Boris Johnson knows a lot about ancient rhetoric, so he knows exactly what kind of, how Plato would think about it. But anyway, and yet he's doing it. I mean, you know, how do we deal with that? Why isn't anything sticking? Why is reality bouncing off this rhetoric?
So I don't know. I mean, I obviously don't know. I mean, one possibility is that we are buried in information and views and data, so much so that we can barely keep the attention. So people may have noticed that in a BBC debate, he said that there was going to be a transition period with the no-deal Brexit, but within 3-4 days, all that is forgotten, and we're just sort of back to, well, we've got to get this done, do or die, or we've become, it's very difficult to land a blow. It's very difficult, if you were Jeremy Paxman, to ask a killer question 6 times and actually pin someone down. The whole world has become very, very slippery. And I suspect that must be because we're losing, probably we no longer have a kind of belief in objectivity, belief in truth, belief in authority strong enough for it to matter anymore. That we live, maybe it's that we seem to live in this sort of strange internet jungle where any number of facts and pieces of information are sort of circulating around. We're all experts in our own way. Every fact and information is questioned, so that the real problem for somebody like me is if I'm being boring and saying, how are you going to do that? How are you going to do that? How are you going to do it? No, but how are you going to get from A to B? Actually, people will just think, this guy, he's just an apologist for the status quo. He just makes problems all the time. We don't want problems. We want solutions. We want optimism. We want cheerfulness. We don't want all these details. This guy's kind of getting in the way with all these nonsensical details. It's not what we're asking for. We're asking for leadership, and somehow the idea of leadership has become fairy tales, that, the leader is the person who can produce the most sort of absurd and extravagant fairy tale. Yeah.
And how broad a problem do you think that is? Because if you look at, Italy, if you look at India, if you look at Poland, if you look, at America, there are leaders apparently using the same playbook. Would you put Boris Johnson in that same category? How scared are you?
Well, look, this is a very difficult question, and I'll try to be as straightforward as I can with you, while also explaining that he is my party leader and I'm a Conservative MP. So
sometimes it's hard to know why.
And furthermore, I also lost the leadership race to him, so I'm also going to sound like a bitter loser if I'm rude about him. But I think the general phenomenon is clearly there. Quite clearly, one of the things that made him very successful is that he was a celebrity. Just much, much more famous than anyone else. When we did the polling, the major reason that he totally outpolled the rest of us is that he was the only person anyone had heard of.
Have I got news for you?
Yeah.
Had essentially created the Prime Minister.
Something like 90% of the British population knew who he was, whereas barely 30-40% knew who Jeremy Hunt was. And so that's a huge advantage before you begin. So one of the great things that Trump has, or that a comedian in Ukraine can have, is just celebrity, just being more famous. I think the second thing is that there is a yearning to get away from technocratic politics. People are looking for something more from politics. They don't want it just to be a question of details and problems and how do you get from A to B. They really, really want dreams. They want ideas. And this is why we all consume endless movies about Churchill. We have this sort of great dream of an era where it's possible to make Churchillian speeches, where the stakes are so high. I felt this even when I was in the Foreign Office. When I was getting fed up with my job, I remember feeling as a 24-year-old, I would stick with this job if I was fighting Nazi Germany. That would be the reason to be doing this, rather than sitting in an embassy in Indonesia, not quite clear what on earth Britain thought they were doing or what we were up to. So I think in a way they're playing into a nostalgia, a desire for heroism and grandeur, whereas actually what really matters to our lives is, how do you fix the broken windows in the prison? How do you make sure the prison officers have got their handbook to make sure that they do a cell inspection correctly? How do you get that guy out of the doorstep in Tesco's into an addiction treatment program, which he will fail in the first time, fail in the second time, fail in the third time, but maybe in the fourth time he's going to get clean and his life's going to get turned around. Those are actually the important questions in modern politics, but nobody really wants to have a conversation with me about how the fourth time round of an addiction treatment program in heroin in Glasgow works. What we want to hear is, Britain is great. It's all going to be different. We're going to rip it up. We're going to have a no-deal Brexit. We're going to launch into a new world, because there is still this sort of craving for a sort of heroic vision, which has so little to do with the business of government.
How do you, clearly it's fantasy, but that narrative, it's disturbingly fantastical. But how do you craft a new narrative that takes us forward? This is what we all want, some kind of answer, some kind of path into the future. How do you craft a narrative out of mending the windows in the prison, or...
Well, you've got to take back the words. You've got to explain that words like courage, patriotism, truth, are words that live in the center ground. They have no meaning in fairy tales. The courage of a superhero is not courage. I mean, if you're actually Superman, you're not courageous because you have superpowers, right? You don't live in the real world, right? Real courage is about, and this is where Aristotle was right. I mean, Charlotte is a great classical scholar. Aristotle points out that courage is the point between, the intermediate point between cowardice on the one hand and foolhardiness. There is no honor, there's no virtue in foolhardiness. There's no virtue in claiming to do what you cannot do. There's no virtue in leading your soldiers into enemy machine gun fire. This stuff is not virtuous. The virtue is knowing who you are, knowing what this time is in history, knowing what this place, Edinburgh, is, knowing what Scotland is, knowing what Britain is, knowing what our real options in the world are. And we need to reclaim those things. We need to understand that actually that's true of our own lives too, that what makes us heroes in our individual lives is about a real understanding of who we are, not an adolescent fantasy of superpower. And if I can reclaim that truth that we know in our own lives and re-inject that into politics, suffering, failure, risk, all the mess that is our own lives, all the divorces in this room, all the failures in the room, all the bankruptcies in the room, all the ways in which each one of us is less than we wanted to be, and make the heroism out of that, then you have a real politics.
Sadly, we both know that Boris Johnson has read the Nike-McKeown ethics, and it just sort of bounced off him, unfortunately. Rory, I want to ask you about the union. It seems like it's incredibly hard to defend the union right now, and clearly the Scottish nationalists are making political weather out of that as you would. And you of all people, your book The Marches is so kind of brilliant on the historical contingency of national borders, and I know you sort of land on the idea of that being an argument for the union, but in a funny way it could be an argument for quite the opposite. Why don't we make a new settlement? Why don't we kind of cut things another way? Do you think the union has a long-term prospect of survival?
Well, I really hope so, because for me the United Kingdom represents complexity, compromise, trade-offs. It's an argument against oversimplification. In the end, nationalism is reductive. It always involves reducing the size of a country. It always involves pretending that there is a big, simple solution. So generally speaking, in any nationalism, in any country, although it's not made explicit, implicitly, subconsciously, the argument is usually that the fundamental problems that you face in your country, and those problems are usually just the problems of being a modern state. Inequality, poverty, exclusion, addiction, education, health. These problems can be solved just by drawing a line on a map. If we just have a border, if we just cut ourselves off from them, then our problems will be solved, right? And it isn't true, right? Nothing generally is solved by drawing a line in the sand and saying we're going to become smaller, we're going to get rid of them. It's the instinct that also in relationships, it's the same instinct that says, I'm better off on my own. This relationship is too messy. If I can just get rid of all this baggage and junk around this other person or my family, I'm going to be better. I don't need it. I'm better on my own, right? The instinct has to be the opposite. That's why I'm against the no-deal Brexit. It's the same thing. No deal is the same. No deal is the negative. Nope, we don't need them. We don't want the others. Better off on our own. We don't want all the mess and complexity. The mess and complexity is what makes us, right? It's reaching out. It's embracing. It's being a tumultuous, chaotic country that contains Glasgow and London, that contains the Highlands and Devon, that has that tension between Scottish and English and Welsh and Northern Irish. That's actually what makes us. Without that, we become terribly boring, terribly reduced as an enterprise.
I'm sure the audience will have comments to make on that. I would only say that sometimes divorce is a very radical and creative and positive act. As you may know from your own life. Rory, talking of Nicola Sturgeon, there's something that Nicola always says at the festival. She's a great figure here and speaks every year and speaks beautifully. And she often finds time to say that she thinks that political leaders would be better at their jobs if they read more literature. And every time she says this, I think, absolutely, you're so right, Nicola, because it's such a wonderful, such an optimistic thing to say, and it's about listening to other narratives, it's about empathy, it's about not being that person who only looks at policy papers and reports. And so I get it, and then the other part of me thinks, well, lots of politicians I don't like are great, or, you know, I should be a bit more impartial, but there are politicians who read a lot, and I'm not convinced that it makes them better politicians, you know. So, you know, Jeremy Hunt's a great fan of Mandelstam, and Sajid Javid is a great fan of Ayn Rand, and Michael Gove is a great proponent of reading, and, you know, Boris Johnson loves Homer. I don't think that... I'm not sure that it makes them better people, so I'm not sure whether I can really go with Nicola Sturgeon's kind of wonderful statement about literature and politics, but I wonder what you think.
Well, I think it lies in the nature of the reader. I mean, any one of us can plough our way through books without it having much impact on us. I think being a reader is like saying that you're a churchgoer. It doesn't tell you much about the state of your soul, right? You can go to church in many different ways. You can read a book in many different ways. And if it were true that the reading of literature was sufficient to make you a great-souled individual, then all our English teachers should be running the country, right?
They might be doing a better job than the present.
They might be, or they might not. I mean, I love reading, but I think there are many of us who read a lot of books without necessarily being as happy or as wise as we would hope as a result of reading those books. There are a lot of politicians who claim to love literature who I'm not sure have read quite as many books as they suggest. But I do, and it's also how interesting for me how really, truly great writers almost never write about politics or politicians. It's almost impossible to think of a writer, truly great writer that I really admire, that really focuses on a politician, because politicians are really not interesting people. They have no souls, really. They have no private life. They are just... There's this lovely line from Auden where he says, a private face in a public place is better than a public face in a private place. And the politician is always a public face in a private place. I mean, there's nothing there. There's nothing, if you peel the onion, there's nothing there. So the only character in literature, I think, I can think of who is a sort of a relatively sympathetically described politician is Oblonsky in Anna Karenina, who clearly Tolstoy thinks is a bit of a fatuous fool, but is rather a charming administrator. He's clearly rather good at his sort of pseudo-ministerial job and filling out chits and dealing with his civil servants. But generally, I don't think there's anything in politicians that can really attract the interest or the sympathy of a writer, or indeed, actually the sympathy of the public. I think the idea that the public is capable of feeling sort of affection or pity towards politicians is also sort of unimaginable. What the public really wants is for us to work harder, be paid less, apologize more, be humiliated more, live more real lives, resign more often. But generally, to ask of the public or a writer that they should see a politician as a human is to ask too much.
Politics, I think, you're talking about novels. Politics, of course, is a fantastic subject for drama and the subject of great playwriting. David Hare and James Graham and TV, The Crown, which always centres on the current Prime Minister. And I think that sort of feeds into what you're saying, because it's about, those dramas are about conflicts, they're about people having arguments with each other. They're not about interiority. And so the best moments in literature into which, say, Margaret Thatcher comes, because she is like a shadow in certain stories and novels, isn't she? There's a sort of wonderful scene in The Line of Beauty where she dances with the protagonist, but you only get this kind of perfumed glimpse of her. And ditto in Hilary Mantel's story, The Assassination of Margaret Thatcher, she barely appears, you hear her footsteps. And Philip Hench's novel, his first novel, Kitchen Venom, I think she narrates part of it. So you do, but I think it sort of has to be, maybe, you're right, there's a sort of ghostly presence of somebody like her rather than a sense of interiority.
Yeah, the only interiority of a politician I'm really aware of is Thomas Mann. So Lottie in Weimar, Goethe wakes up in the morning, and Goethe is a sort of practicing prime minister of this little state. And we're taken into a sort of daydream reverie where he goes all the way between sort of sexual fantasies and concerns about bits of administration and tax and revenue. But that's the only real attempt I've seen to try to... And of course, Goethe isn't primarily a politician. He's a kind of global genius who just happens to be masquerading as a politician.
I make no remark about our interviewee today. I think it's time for us to involve the audience in this.
Yeah.
You'll all have 5 novels that feature politicians beautifully drawn with great interiority. But while I wait for the yes, find a hand and put a mic in it, could I just ask you to make your questions brief and to the point? That would be marvellous. And please, you have the mic.
Thank you. You started the hour talking about the addiction problems in Glasgow. My question for you is around community. So you are an MP not in Scotland, and there's an argument that lots of people voted for Brexit because they wanted to get away from London rule. What do you think the role is of the community, not just politicians, in terms of where we are right now?
Well, I think communities are a very interesting word because it draws on a very historical idea of a village where everybody's rooted in the soil, everybody's related to each other, everybody's been living there for hundreds of years. But when we apply it to modern Britain, we mean something so different that we should almost be using a different word. And that's been true in Britain for probably 200 years. By 1805, 50% of the population of central Scotland was not living where they were born. In the most romantic Lake District villages, which I go into, which give the impression of sort of 800 years of oral history, it'll turn out that 90% of the people in the village today are not living where they were born. And if you go to the Scottish borders, you go to Roxburgh, for example, Roxburgh Mains, and you read all these books about the border reivers, and you think that you're right up on the edge of the Roman frontier, but you look at the people in the village, and it will turn out that will be 2 consultants, 1 aromatherapist, 2 masseurs, a colonel, a contractor. I mean, and out of that, then, we have to shape our community. We're shaping communities out of situations where we often don't really know our neighbours, or we get to know our neighbours extravagantly as young retired people moving to the Lake District, throwing ourselves into community life, with inverted commas. So we run the local pantomime, we work with the parish council, but we do that sort of in a burst of energy for 10 or 15 years, and sort of collapse again, right? And then we actually give up because actually our children aren't living there, so we move down to Devon. We could give up on the whole project again. So this thing, community, to operate in the modern world will have to be very different, and sometimes, it could even be rather interesting. I mean, it could be digitally enabled. I mean, is it possible, for example, if you live in Edinburgh, but your mother lives in London, for me to visit your mother in London and you to visit my mother in Crieff, right? Could we trade off trade off community relationships or contacts. But getting into the heart of that, getting into how much time someone's got, where do they live, how long are they going to be there, these things really, really matter. Because otherwise you're back to my problem with these letters, these capital letters: austerity, poverty, community. What does it really mean here? What does it really mean for that guy sitting in that door in Tesco's on his methadone script, shooting up with heroin, who has 6 siblings living within half a mile of him and a mother living within half a mile of him, and 15 nephews and nieces who pass him every day but who don't really want to talk to him because their uncles are heroin addicts? I mean, what does community mean in that context? Yeah.
The microphone's over here. Please go ahead.
Hi, Rory. I find it very fascinating about your walks through the Middle East, Asia, United Kingdom, even in Glasgow earlier today. I seen a video earlier today, and me coming from Glasgow, even that was shocking to me. But the one thing that crosses my mind is that obviously, after running for PM, you're not exactly a low-level politician. You're kind of becoming a popular figure in politics. So do you ever feel concerned for your safety when you're out in these walks?
Not in Britain. Not in Britain. It's becoming difficult now if I go to somewhere like Afghanistan or Iraq, just because the chances now of my being recognized and kidnapped are higher than it was 10, 12 years ago. And that is purely because of social media. It's simply because the Afghan social media got interested in the possibility of my campaign to be Prime Minister and the fact that I speak an Afghan language. Generally in Britain, I don't feel under threat. What I feel, though, is something worse. As a sort of minor celebrity now, if I get on a train, London to Cumbria, 3.5 hours, 45 separate people came up to talk to me. When I flew with my 2 little kids and my wife to Marbella, I was talking at the plane loo on Jet2 Airlines, and suddenly realized that everybody else queuing in the loo knew who I was. So the conversation I'm having with my wife is suddenly being listened to in a very different way. I'm not sure about that. I think I may have reached a sort of level. So I think now, I don't know, but probably my sense in these areas is that maybe 40-50% of people know who I am, and of those 10% are coming up to introduce themselves. That's not pleasant, because you suddenly, if you're not careful, are taking the expectations of too many people. Too many people come up, very, very well-meaning people, and they say very nicely, "Well done, you should be our next Prime Minister, stick at it, Rory, you're the future, keep speaking the truth." And I say, "Thank you very much." But what I actually, and they say, "No problem, no bother, thank you." Or they say, the classic line is, "I'd never vote Conservative, but I'd vote for you." Very useful, right? very, very useful statement.
Come back to the Labour Party.
Yeah, exactly, very useful statement. But actually, it's a bit dangerous. You realize why. I mean, I get a tiny glimpse of why I don't think celebrities tend to be very happy, because if you're not careful, if you take those statements too seriously, you begin to impose expectations on yourself, which are ludicrous. These are strangers who don't know you from Adam. I mean, they have no idea about you. They've concentrated on you for 10 minutes. They've projected onto you some funny vision that you're some heroic truth teller who's going to save the country, and then you have to go around working out what you do with that. And the answer is that generally you have to ignore it.
You have the microphone.
Thank you. Thank you, Rory. My question is a bit similar, actually, to your answer just now. When I listen to you this evening, I hear truth and I hear honesty. And I wondered, can a nice guy get to be Prime Minister?
You admit failure more than other politicians.
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer is possibly they can. I mean, I had a boss who was the Secretary of State for Justice, David Gork, who genuinely is a very, very, very nice guy. I mean, he's modest, he's thoughtful, he's intelligent. He's the best boss I've ever had, and he was Secretary of State for Justice, Lord Chancellor of England. Now, whether he could quite become Prime Minister, I'm not sure, because in a way, what makes him so extraordinary is that he's very modest. I mean, he's a very understated, very quiet man. So it may be quite difficult for him to project. I think the bigger risk is that you actually don't remain nice very long. Politics is a very, very damaging, corrosive thing. After 9-10 years in politics, your mind, your heart, your soul is actually eroded in 100 ways that you can't quite begin to describe and imagine. So that it's almost impossible to imagine, because unfortunately once you became Prime Minister, even if you were nice when you began, you'd very quickly cease to be. Because you'd go mad. I mean, actually being Prime Minister is a form of madness. It's a form of sort of strange vanity. I mean, ego is at the heart of it. Vanity, ego, insecurity, craving, aversion, ignorance. These things are so deeply bound in with this very poor livelihood of being a politician that I don't think that you could continue to be good for very long.
Why did you want to do it?
Well, I thought that I could change things. So I became a politician really because I was very angry about the Iraq War and then about Afghanistan. And I felt as a civil servant, as a diplomat on the ground arguing against these things, that the people that had made the decisions to invade Iraq and Afghanistan were the politicians. And if I could become a politician, then when I was at the top, I could stop these things. So I imagined that, I would arrive in Parliament and I'd be able to sort of stop craziness of British foreign policy. I'd be able to bring sense to the system. I'd be able to sort it out, because as a civil servant, you blame the politicians a lot, and I did. I was a civil servant for a decade, blaming politicians. But of course, once you are there, you realize how astonishingly weird the situation is. I mean, I'm not going to bang on about it too much, but one of the weirdest things is they never leave you in a job long enough to do anything. So I was the environment minister for 11 months. Huge privilege, running all the national parks, responsible for the Environment Agency for Natural England. 11 months later, I'm made the Middle East Asia minister. I'm just getting to grips with the war in Syria. 7 months later, they make me the Africa minister. I chase around Africa. I meet 13 African heads of states. I develop these relationships. I write the Africa strategy for the British government. And a day before my Africa strategy is due to be signed off, I made the prisons minister. Right, I then say, okay, I'm going to turn around violence in prisons. If I don't turn around violence in 12 months, I'm going to resign. And about 11 months into my job, I made the Secretary of State for International Development, right? So it is actually, in a system like this, almost impossible to do anything. I mean, none of you could, I don't think, unless you spotted something like that. It isn't sensible to think that you can achieve something in a year. You're just laying the foundations. You need 4 or 5 years, really. 2 years to turn it around, 2 years to bed it down, a year to maybe see your success at least. So I think our system needs to be blown up from the bottom.
Call for revolution. There are so many hands, and the microphone's over here somewhere.
Hi. I wanted to ask, I feel like I'm putting you in the spot because it's about a government of national unity, and you've said you don't want people putting you in I met you at the door, actually, and I'm glad I didn't say anything like, you should be PM or something like that, because clearly that's not a good thing. But yeah, are you willing to meet, I think Joe Swinton's pretty much said that anybody that leads a government of national unity would have to give up future ambitions to lead the country or their party. At the beginning of the conversation, you sounded like you'd maybe started to reassess how likely those were. Would you be willing to lead a government of national unity to stop no deal?
So I'd definitely be willing to give up my future in the party and this and the other. I think the question for the government of national unity is, what's it trying to do? And this is, the problem for me is this, that I believe in this very unpopular idea of a compromise, of a sort of pragmatic, moderate Brexit, where we leave the political institutions of the European Union and we remain close to Europe economically, diplomatically, etc. And what is this government of national unity doing when it's stopping a no-deal Brexit? Is it stopping a no-deal Brexit in order to have another go at a compromise soft Brexit, or is it doing it in order to hold a second referendum and push for Remain? If it's doing it to go for the second referendum, push for Remain, then I'm not the person to lead that, because I'm very worried about that. I'm worried that if you had a second referendum, either people vote for a hard no-deal Brexit, which I hate, or they vote for Remain, and by a small margin, and then I'm very worried about what that then means for the next 10, 20 years. And so I don't get this government of national unity. I'd love to be Prime Minister. I'd love to sort out our prisons. I'd love to really put some time into thinking about how this country worked with adult social care. I mean, I think that would be just the most wonderful thing to do with your life, if we could really work out how to look after the elderly sustainably, properly in Britain. But it doesn't sound like that's what this government of national unity is doing. It sounds like it's a sort of funny parliamentary maneuver. So, and if that's all it's trying to do, if all it's trying to do is hold a second referendum, Parliament can vote for that without having a government of national unity.
Thank you. The microphone's here.
Rory, how do you stop political nationalism marching across Europe and United Kingdom?
Well, the only way to stop political nationalism marching across is to really dig into the moral outrage against nationalism in its worst forms. I mean, in Germany, people understand what's wrong with nationalism. I mean, really, really understand it. Even in France, even though nationalism is on the rise, basically most people in France get it. They get what's wrong with it. We live in a very strange country where, because of our experience in the Second World War, we never really had to think about what the negative sides of nationalism might be. So I was in Cumbria at a dinner party with a French professor and with a 70-year-old Cumbrian, very wealthy Cumbrian man, who suddenly started saying to this French professor, "You'll never understand us because you lost at Agincourt and Crécy." Right? Right? And this French professor's thinking, out of your mind. I mean, Agincourt's in 1415. What are you talking about? It's completely insane. I mean, the idea that a French person would be banging on about a battle in 1415, I mean, it isn't. I mean, England in 1415 is a completely foreign country. It's got nothing to do with us. They barely spoke an English that we would understand. I mean, it's ridiculous, right? But somehow we have continued, because we think it's, we think it doesn't matter talking about Bannockburn or William Wallace or Crécy or Agincourt or Henry V or whatever. We take it quite lightly because we never went through the experience of the Second World War. We never sensed just how crazy this stuff is. It literally has nothing to do with our lives. Right? My sons are related to 30 of the commanders who fought at Bannockburn. I can assure you, those people, if you were to meet them today, nothing in common with them. I mean, right? These people, I mean, these people, Robert the Bruce, John de Balliol, I mean, their names are French names. I mean, John de Balliol, when he loses, retires to Balliol in Picardy, where he comes from. I mean, they spoke French. They went off on crusade. They're all related to each other on either side. I mean, these Robert the Bruce and Edward I, I mean, his father and Edward I, great mates. I mean, they're all, there is a tiny aristocratic coterie of weird Anglo-Norman landowners. I mean, the idea that these people have anything to do with modern life is just mad. So, yeah, we have to point to insanity.
Hiya. So you mentioned that it could have been the media that made Boris Johnson, and I know that you're pretty savvy with your smartphone, doing your selfie videos, which is quite popular. Do you think social media could ever make a politician, or otherwise, do you think there should be restrictions on the media that is making the politicians, perhaps biasedly?
No, I think you're right. I think that's where it's got to be. I think we've got to learn to make the arguments for the center ground through Facebook, through Twitter, through Instagram. We can't cede it to the extremists. And I think it can be done. I mean, I really discovered actually the positive power of this. I would give an interview to the Daily Telegraph on adult social care, and they would ignore it completely and just write about me smoking opium in Iran, right? And I would then put out a small video which I recorded in Edinburgh on adult social care, which the Telegraph thought was too boring to print. and 650,000 people would watch it. I'd put out something on Brexit. 2.2 million people will watch a little thing that you put out on Twitter. I mean, there is huge power to actually include people to talk about things that we deeply, deeply care about, jump over the heads of the media. But we can't allow that to be just the domain of Donald Trump. We've got to take that back. Take it back.
Someone has a microphone up here? Yeah, go for it.
You mentioned earlier that you felt like you were quite alone in the centre ground. I think that's possibly just the case within the Conservative Party. It feels quite depressing for those of us who don't buy Boris's optimism, but to be pro-Union and pro-Europe these days feels quite a lonely place to be. So what optimism can we take for the next few years, if that's our view?
Well, I think we just have to trust in reality and truth. That in the end, the arguments we're making are richer and more complicated in a good way. They're more mature. And that in the end, sense and maturity will win through. So we just have to keep pushing and pushing and pushing and accept that the better side of humanity is on the side of complexity, inclusion, compromise, moderation, the center ground. And that it's the worst side of ourselves that wants to polarize and wants to push to the extremes.
It could be quite ugly when the fantasy actually hits the buffers of reality this autumn, though.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the thing that, of course, is true of this, that the problem is that if I and my colleagues fail to prevent a no-deal Brexit, now or in the future, because we might well win in Parliament in September, but then just get another extension and then lose again in March. I mean, people are very determined on Brexit, and they're very uninterested in a compromise at the moment. When the impact of that is felt, and I believe the impact will be significantly negative, I mean, there will be real economic consequences of this for our car industry, for farmers, etc. Very cleverly, they won't blame the no-deal Brexit for that. They'll blame me. Right? Somehow it will be the fault of Europe or this sort of evil elite or the parliamentary conspirators who somehow prevented it being the successful Brexit that it could have been if only they'd been allowed to do it. That's the great trick of populism, that it's immune to real consequences because the narrative can just keep being reframed.
I'm going to take one last question.
Okay, thank you. Firstly, as a woman, it's great to have children in the room. Thank you for bringing your children here. Secondly, given how isolated you are within your own party, two things. Firstly, wouldn't it make sense to switch parties? And if you don't want to switch parties and you don't want to be part of a government of national unity, how about building a coalition based on those values you talked about, like compassion, courage, honesty?
The Tory party, as it is in government, in the cabinet, the Tory party of Britannia Unchained, it seems to me to be so entirely different from the Tory party of tradition and conservatism with a small c that you, it seems to me, operate in. I think that's a kind of really good question. So go ahead.
Yeah, well, I mean, I have to keep coming back to my belief that the things that made me a conservative, which are a belief in prudence at home, restraint abroad, limited government, respect for individual rights, respect for tradition, love of landscape, love of history. I mean, all these things which make me in a sort of a Tory are there still. I mean, I'm not a revolutionary. I'm not a rationalist. I'm going to finish with a quote from Yeats, because he says in explaining conservatism against what he calls Whiggery, and Whiggery for him is the rationalist tradition of politics. He says, he's talking about Irishmen, not Scots, but it's a good way of ending. He says of Hume, of Berkeley, of Goldsmith, of Burke, he says, all hated Whiggery, that levelling, rational rancorous sort of mind that never looked out of the eye of a saint or out of a drunkard's eye. All's wiggery now, and we old men are massed against the world. Thank you very much.
Well done. I just have to say... Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to thank Rory again, but I just want to do this tiny, tiny bit of housekeeping, which is that Rory is now going to be signing books in the signing tent. So you want to leave the tent, go left and left again. But the most important thing is that you have to wait until we've gone, or else he will never get there. But could you join me again in thanking Rory for a really terrific, fascinating hour?
Thank you.
Let's go.
Thank you.
Great.